Her own children called her a frail, fading old woman, whispering behind her back that she wouldn't even know the difference. As they plotted to get power of attorney, sell her home and move her somewhere manageable, all to solve their own money problems. But they made one fatal miscalculation. The confused old lady they were trying to defraud wasn't just a resident in their mother's luxury home. She was the secret owner of the entire empire. The Sunday brunch at the Golden Willow Estates is a masterpiece of deception. From the outside, we must have looked like the perfect family. The Arizona sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining hall, glinting off the polished silverware and the crystal water glasses. My son David and my daughter Susan sat across from me, smiling and making polite conversation about their week. But I've always been a student of details, and the details were all wrong. Susan would praise the perfectly manicured gardens, then let out a theatrical sigh, wondering aloud what the water bill must be for a place like this. David would compliment the chef on the quality of the salmon, but then immediately pivot, asking if I was sure I needed the full meal plan. It was, he reminded me with a tight smile, the most expensive tier. Every compliment was a Trojan horse carrying a complaint about money inside. They spoke the language of concern, but their grammar was pure resentment. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were auditing it. I watched them over the rim of my teacup. They thought my silence was a sign of blissful ignorance, the gentle fading of a woman in her late 70s. But silence isn't empty. It's a space you can fill with observation. I noticed the faint hairline crack on the screen of David's new iPhone, a crack he hadn't bothered to fix. I saw that Susan was carrying a designer handbag from 5 seasons ago, the leather on the handles worn smooth from anxious hands. When we walked out, I saw their car, a respectable SUV, but it was the older model, the one before the redesign, already looking dated, next to the gleaming new vehicles in the residence parking lot. They looked at the effortless luxury of my home, not with pride for my comfort, but with the corrosive envy of people who feel they are falling behind. They saw my peace as their expense. Later that afternoon, I had a visitor. Mr. Chen, my late husband's lawyer and a dear friend of 40 years, stopped by my villa. He never arrived with a briefcase, just a warm smile, and a box of the pastries I liked from a bakery in town. We sat on my patio overlooking the golf course. We spoke of his grandchildren and my garden. But beneath the pleasantries, there was another conversation. He'd ask if everything was running smoothly, and I'd tell him that the dividends were performing as expected. He mentioned he'd be attending the annual Gala next month, and I told him I was looking forward to reviewing the quarterly reports with him there. It was a language of quiet reassurance, a confirmation that the empire my husband and I had built so carefully was still secure, still mine. He was the only other person who knew that my name, Harriet Vance, wasn't just on the lease of my villa, it was on the deed to the entire development. As he was leaving, David and Susan called again, their voices tight with a shared anxiety. David brought up a materials cost overrun on a job site that was eating him alive. Susan launched into a tirade about an unexpected jump in her town's school taxes. I listened patiently, making the right sympathetic noises. I understood they were under pressure. What I didn't yet understand was how they planned to relieve it. I walked Mr. Chen to the main gate. On my way back, instead of taking the main path, I took a shortcut through the quiet rose garden that ran behind the guest parking area. It was a mistake. Or perhaps it was fate. I heard their voices first, sharp and conspiratorial, slicing through the tranquil afternoon air. It was David. He said he couldn't keep this up, that the payments were bleeding him dry. Then Susan's voice, low and determined. She said there was a way out. They would get power of attorney claiming I was no longer competent. They would sell my primary residence, the home I'd shared with their father for 40 years, and move me somewhere manageable. Her final words hung in the air, more chilling than any curse. She said I would never even know the difference. That night, sleep was a stranger, but I didn't lie in the dark, weeping. Grief is a hot, messy emotion, and what I felt was the exact opposite: a cold, clean, diamond-hard fury. The woman my children thought I was a frail, fading creature who wouldn't know the difference would have cried. But I have always known the difference. I sat up in my favorite armchair, my tablet glowing in the darkness, the soft light illuminating my face. I wasn't looking at old family photos. I was scrolling through financial statements, corporate bylaws, and resident account ledgers. Their words echoed in my head not as a source of pain, but as a piece of data. Get power of attorney. Sell her primary residence. Move her somewhere manageable. It was a business proposal, and I decided to treat it as such. The love and trust account was closed. Now we were just dealing with the numbers. At 7 o'clock sharp the next morning, I made a single phone call. Mr. Chen picked up on the first ring, as I knew he would. I kept my voice calm and even. I told him I needed him to activate Protocol Vance effective immediately. There was a brief pause on the other end, a silence not of confusion, but of sober understanding. Protocol Vance wasn't a secret weapon. It was something we had established years ago as a contingency. It was a simple, elegant instruction. It meant that all special privileges, all familial overrides, and all personal exceptions associated with my resident account were to be immediately revoked. My account, and by extension, my children's access, was to be treated exactly like any other resident subject, to the same rules, fees, and consequences. For years, I had personally absorbed the costs and forgiven the late payments they never even knew they were making. The protocol simply turned off the tap. It was time for them to see what the real world looked like without my invisible safety net. The following Saturday, they arrived. I knew they were coming. Their visits were as predictable as the setting sun. I was seated at my usual small table in the residence cafe, which offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the main lobby. They walked in, laughing about something, David clapping his hand on Susan's shoulder. They radiated a breezy confidence, the assurance of people who believe they are in charge. They approached the polished marble reception desk to scan their guest keycards, the way they always did. The first sign of trouble was the quiet, negative beep. David tried his card again. Another beep. He frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Susan pushed him aside and tried her own card with an exasperated sigh. The same result. Thomas, the head concierge, looked up. He was a master of professional poise. With a voice clear and steady enough to carry across the lobby, he addressed them. He said their names and informed them that he was sorry, but their access had been restricted. The system, he explained, showed their family account was severely delinquent. The change was instantaneous. The laughter vanished. The confidence curdled into disbelief, then morphed into red-faced humiliation. The lobby, which had been humming with the quiet conversations of my friends and neighbors, suddenly felt silent, every eye now on the unfolding drama at the desk. David's voice was a low growl, insisting there had to be a mistake, a computer glitch. Susan, her voice rising with panic, demanded to speak to a manager immediately. She declared that they were Mrs. Vance's children, as if that name were a magic word that should solve all problems. Thomas simply held his ground, his expression a perfect mask of polite regret. He calmly stated that without payment, he couldn't grant them access. It was, he said simply, the policy. They were no longer family. They were a policy violation. From my seat in the cafe, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Earl Grey tea. The chaos, the shame, the frantic, whispered argument that was now breaking out between my two children, it all felt very, very far away. Then through the crowd, Susan's eyes found mine. Her face was a storm of horror, dawning comprehension, and raw panic. She saw me sitting there perfectly calm, watching the consequences of her own actions play out like a scene in a movie. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I simply met her terrified gaze, held it for a long moment, and gave her the smallest, most imperceptible nod. It was all the confirmation she needed. This was not a mistake. This was a consequence. The fury of my children, I discovered, had the half-life of a mayfly. After their spectacular humiliation in the lobby, their panic quickly hardened into a shell of self-righteous indignation. It was, I learned through the facility's surprisingly efficient grapevine, the only narrative that could salvage their shattered pride. Their mother wasn't a shrewd woman enforcing a contract. She was a confused old lady having a vindictive episode. My calculated move wasn't a consequence. It was a symptom. The embarrassment they felt wasn't their fault. It was proof that I was becoming senile and needed to be protected from myself. Their initial plot was no longer a greedy scheme, but a sad necessity. They redoubled their efforts now, armed with a righteous cause. I heard they were making calls to geriatric specialists, trying to schedule a competency hearing. They also sent a flurry of furious emails to the facility's general manager, demanding a formal meeting to discuss my erratic and punitive behavior. They were going to go over my head blissfully, unaware that they were simply appealing to a lower branch of my own organization. I, in turn, gave them the performance they expected. I let my shoulders slump. I took my meals in my villa instead of the bustling dining hall. When staff members passed on messages from my children, I would seem confused, murmuring something about a misunderstanding that I was just too tired to deal with. I let them see me walking slowly through the gardens, looking lost in thought, a frail little old lady, overwhelmed by a conflict of her own making. The storm of their angry calls and texts went unanswered. My silence was the canvas onto which they painted their masterpiece of self-deception. They saw my retreat as a victory, a sign that their pressure was working. They believed I was crumbling. They had no idea I was consolidating my power. While they were busy trying to book a conference room, I was in the private business center on the third floor, a room they didn't even know existed. I wasn't hiding. I was commanding. On the large screen in front of me were the faces of the board of directors of Vance Senior Living Corp., piped in through a secure video link. They saw the same. Harriet, the world saw, calm, quiet, polite. But they knew my quietness was the space where decisions were made. As I instructed them on the next steps, my mind drifted back to the beginning, to a tiny, drafty duplex in Ohio that my late husband Robert and I bought with every penny we had. He was the salesman, the warm handshake, and the booming, confident laugh that could charm anyone. I was the silent partner, the one who stayed up all night with the ledgers and a sharpening pencil, the one who could see the hidden value in a dilapidated property, the one who structured the deals that made us millions. He was the face of the empire. I was the architect. This place, the Golden Willow, was my passion project, the culmination of my life's work after he was gone. My children saw it as a gilded cage they were forced to pay for. They never understood it was my throne. My children were fighting a ghost, a frail memory of their mother. They had no concept of the woman on that screen, the woman who was now methodically reviewing Arizona's statutes on financial elder abuse with her chief counsel. And my chief counsel was a very busy man. While I handled the grand strategy, Mr. Chen was my general in the field. He was a bulldog, but a quiet and meticulous one. On my instruction, he had already, through perfectly legal channels, acquired the documents that told the real story. He had David's business credit reports glowing red with default notices. He had copies of the pre-foreclosure warnings on Susan's oversized house. He was assembling a file, a thick, heavy stack of paper that represented their desperation and deceit. Each page was a nail he was preparing to hammer into the coffin of their arrogance. They were demanding a meeting with management, and I was going to make sure they got one. They just had no idea who they were about to meet. I was not in the boardroom when my children arrived for their meeting, but I have seen the recording. I have listened to the audio more than once. Mr. Chen, with his usual meticulous attention to detail, made sure I experienced every moment of it. David and Susan strode into the main corporate boardroom on the executive floor at precisely 3 o'clock. They were dressed for war. David wore a navy power suit that was just a little too tight at the shoulders, and Susan had on a severe gray dress, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. They were radiating righteous anger, ready to tear into some poor mid-level manager over their mother's supposed dementia and the embarrassing incident in the lobby. But the room was empty, save for one man. Mr. Chen sat alone at the far end of the long, gleaming mahogany table, a single leather portfolio in front of him. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. Their aggressive posture faltered for a moment. This wasn't the flustered manager they had expected. Mr. Chen gestured to the chairs opposite him. He didn't stand. He let them walk the entire length of that intimidating room. When they were seated, he introduced himself, his voice calm and quiet, yet it filled the cavernous space. He wasn't Bob Chen, their parents' old lawyer. He informed them, Robert Chen, Chief Counsel, for the entirety of Vance Senior Living Corporation. The confusion on their faces was, I admit, deeply satisfying to watch. He didn't mention their complaints. He didn't ask what they wanted. He simply slid the thick, professionally bound document across the polished table. It stopped perfectly in the space between them. Mr. Chen explained that it was a preliminary file. He said it concerned a potential conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse against a resident of Golden Willow Estates, a resident, he added, named Harriet Vance. Before they could even process the words, he pressed a small button on the sleek speakerphone in the center of the table. And then their own voices filled the tomb-like silence of the boardroom. It was a perfect, high-fidelity recording. David's impatient baritone complaining about the cost. Susan's sharp, conspiratorial whisper outlining the plan to get power of attorney, sell my home, and put me away somewhere manageable. Every damning word was there, crystal clear. The color drained from their faces. They looked like they had seen ghosts, the ghosts of their own greed and betrayal, now sitting in judgment of them. They began to stammer, to deny, to talk over each other with frantic, unconvincing explanations. It was a misunderstanding, a bad joke. They were just stressed. Mr. Chen let them flounder for a full minute, his hands steepled in front of him, watching them with the detached patience of a scientist observing panicked lab rats. When they finally sputtered into silence, he began to slide more papers across the table. One by one. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The first was a notice of intent to lien against David's business for defaulting on a major supplier contract. The next was a stack of delinquent mortgage statements for Susan's home, culminating in a letter threatening foreclosure. He let the documents sit there, a testament to their failure. He told them that their financial advice was clearly not something Mrs. Vance should be taking. Then came the final blow. The owner, he said, had taken a personal interest in this case and was considering pressing full criminal charges. That was the moment the last of the fight drained out of them. Their arrogance, their anger, their self-righteousness, it all evaporated, leaving only a raw, primal terror. Susan buried her face in her hands and began to sob, not with regret, but with the pure fear of being caught. David. His voice cracking, finally broke. He confessed that they were losing everything that they were drowning, that they didn't know what else to do. As their confession hung in the air, Mr. Chen added one more piece of information. He informed them in that same placid tone that it was standard company policy in cases of potential elder abuse to forward a copy of the preliminary file to the Adult Protective Services liaison for the state of Arizona. He explained it was a non-negotiable protocol to ensure transparency and resident safety. I could see the final calculation dawning in their eyes. This was no longer a family squabble over money. This was now a matter of public record, a legal nightmare that could destroy what little was left of their reputations and their lives. Finally, Mr. Chen leaned forward slightly. He told them that Mrs. Vance had been made aware of their situation, and she had decided not to press charges. For now. A flicker of desperate hope must have entered their hearts, only to be extinguished by his next words. He informed them that their attendance was required at the annual Residents and Shareholders Gala tomorrow evening. He pushed 2 embossed invitations across the table. His final sentence was not a request. It was a command delivered with the quiet authority of a man who held all the cards. Attendance, he said, was not optional. They arrived at the annual gala looking like ghosts. The fight had left them replaced by a hollowed-out terror that clung to them like a cheap suit. They were pale, their movements stiff, their eyes darting around the magnificent ballroom as if looking for an executioner. I had arranged for Mr. Chen to greet them at the door, and as they stepped onto the plush carpet, he gave them a slight nod. At that exact moment, their phones buzzed in unison. I know because I was watching from a discreet alcove near the stage. I saw them pull out their phones, their faces already pale, turning to chalk. It was the email I had instructed Mr. Chen to send at 8:01 p.m. It wasn't a threat. It was an invoice. A formal, itemized, and brutally detailed invoice. It listed every single monthly payment they had failed to make for the past year. It included the contractually stipulated late fees for each missed payment. And at the bottom, it included a line item for mandatory legal consultation, billing them at Mr. Chen's corporate rate for the very meeting where they had been so thoroughly dismantled. The final figure was staggering, a life-altering sum that I knew they could not possibly pay. It was due in 30 days. A hostess then guided them to their table. Not one of the grand, flower-laden tables in the center of the room where the community's elite were laughing and networking. No, I had reserved for them table 47. A tiny, isolated table for 2, tucked away in the shadows near a service entrance. They were on display, yet utterly alone, surrounded by the very people whose respect they craved. They sat in silence, 2 small broken figures in a sea of celebration. The CEO of Vance Sr., living a handsome and charismatic man named Mr. Davies, took the stage to a round of applause. He spoke of growth and community, of the excellent care and vibrant lifestyle our residents enjoyed. My children stared blankly at their water glasses, the weight of their ruin pressing down on them. Then Mr. Davies shifted his tone. He said that while the management team worked hard, the true spirit of the Golden Willow came from the vision of one person. The person who not only conceived of the community, but personally financed its creation from the ground up. He paused for dramatic effect. He said that it was his great honor to introduce the heart and soul of their community, the founder and majority shareholder of Vance Senior Living, Mrs. Harriet Vance. I stepped out from the alcove and walked toward the stage. I had chosen my dress with care, a simple but elegant sheath of cobalt blue, a color that radiated confidence and power. The moment the spotlight hit me, the room rose to its feet in a wave of applause. From the stage, the view was perfect. I could see every face, but my eyes sought out only two. I locked gazes with my children at their sad little table in the back. Their faces were masks of pure, slack-jawed horror. The blood had drained away, leaving only a waxy, translucent disbelief. The final terrible truth was landing on them, not like a feather, but like an anvil. They hadn't been withholding payments from a faceless corporation. They had been stealing from their own mother. They weren't fighting some anonymous management company. They were trying to defraud the woman who had signed every one of their report cards, paid for every one of their weddings, and built the very ground on which they now sat in judgment. Their entire reality, the carefully constructed narrative of their own victimhood, was incinerated in that single moment of recognition. I walked to the podium and waited for the applause to fade. I smiled warmly, a benevolent matriarch surveying her thriving community. I spoke about the values my husband Robert and I had held dear. I spoke of integrity, of hard work, and of family. I talked about the sacred responsibility we all have to honor those who came before us. Then, my tone became more serious. I announced that to uphold these values, the board had approved a new family responsibility surcharge. I explained it would be a significant fee applied to any resident account with a history of delinquency, ensuring that the burden of irresponsibility was not shared by the community at large. A ripple of murmurs went through the room, and then I delivered the final perfect stroke. I announced the formation of a new charitable wing of our company, the Vance Family Foundation. Its sole purpose, I explained to thunderous applause, would be to provide financial assistance to residents whose families were facing genuine, unforeseen hardship. The foundation, I declared, would be funded entirely by the proceeds from the new surcharge. I paused, letting the brilliance of it settle, and looked directly at Table 47. I concluded that we must always support those in our community who are truly struggling to protect them from the kind of desperation that can lead to regrettable choices. The room exploded. It was a longer, louder standing ovation than the first. They were applauding my wisdom, my grace, my stunning generosity. They saw a strong, benevolent leader turning a problem into a solution for the needy. They had no idea they were applauding the most precise and public act of justice I could have possibly conceived. I looked one last time at my children. They were not clapping. They were frozen, shattered, utterly defeated. In the eyes of their entire world, they had been exposed as the greedy, ungrateful failures they were. I gave a gracious nod to the audience, turned away from the podium, and walked off the stage, the sound of my victory roaring in my ears. The fallout from the gala was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, inevitable collapse. David and Susan didn't fight the invoice Mr. Chen had sent. There was no fight left in them. The web of their deceit, once exposed, unraveled completely. Within 2 months, the for sale signs went up in front of their large, impressive homes in their manicured neighborhoods. I read the public notices online. First came David's business bankruptcy, a quiet dissolution of the company he had run into the ground. Then came the personal filings. They sold what they could, but it wasn't enough. They walked away from their mortgages and their social standing with nothing. They disappeared from the world they had tried so desperately to cling to, moving into small, anonymous rental apartments in parts of town they used to drive through with their windows up. Their old friends, the ones who had witnessed their humiliation at the gala, stopped calling. In the world they valued so highly, failure was a contagious disease and no one wanted to catch it. In the silence that followed, my children responded in 2 very different ways, each true to their character. About a month after she had lost her house, I received an email from Susan. It had no subject line. The body of the message contained only two words: I'm sorry. It wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was, I believe, the simple, broken admission of a woman who had finally hit the bottom and had nothing left to do but acknowledge the truth. I did not respond. Her apology was for her, not for me. It was the first tiny step on a long road that she would have to walk alone. David, however, chose a different path. He chose the path of the martyr. He constructed a narrative in which he and his sister were the victims of a cruel, vindictive, fabulously wealthy mother who cared more about money than her own children. He told this story to anyone who would listen: old acquaintances, distant relatives, bartenders. But the story never found purchase. The people who knew our family saw it for the self-serving fiction it was, and it only served to isolate him further. He became a pariah, a bitter man haunted by a failure he refused to own. Here at the Golden Willow, my own story took on a new life. The events of the gala became something of a legend, a cautionary tale whispered over card games and afternoon tea. I was no longer just Harriet Vance, the quiet resident in Villa 12. I became a symbol of strength and wisdom. The residents, many of whom had their own quiet fears about their families and their futures, looked at me with a new kind of respect. They saw a woman who had refused to be underestimated, who had protected her dignity and her legacy with a brilliant strategic mind. I hadn't been cruel. I had been precise. I hadn't been vengeful. I had been just. Life settled into a new, more authentic rhythm. The Vance Family Foundation became the focus of my days. Mr. Chen and I established a small board composed of other residents with backgrounds in finance law and social work. Our first meeting was held in that same boardroom where my children's world had collapsed. But now the room was filled not with tension and fear, but with purpose. We reviewed the first applications for assistance: a resident whose son had lost his job due to a sudden illness, a woman whose daughter was a single mother struggling with unexpected medical bills. These were stories of real hardship, of genuine need. I felt a profound sense of peace as I listened, my pen making notes. I was compassionate, but I was also the shrewd woman who had built an empire from a single duplex. We vetted each case carefully, ensuring our help would be a hand up, not a handout. I was finally free from the toxic weight of my children's entitlement. And in its place, I was building something that would last. I was using my power not to punish, but to protect. And in doing so, I had finally truly come home. In the end, Harriet understood that the heaviest debts are not measured in dollars but in disrespect. For years, she had mastered the complexities of financial balance sheets, but she had neglected the most important ledger of all, the one that tracks love and gratitude. She realized that when that account is overdrawn, no amount of money in the world can save you from the final reckoning. And that she knew with a quiet, certain peace is what real accountability looks like.